The heavy, metallic clang of the door closing echoed through the small diner. Daniel stood at the entrance, his worn boots scraping across the tile floor as he hesitated. His eyes scanned the room, nothing like the chaotic noise of a battlefield, but the stillness here felt almost suffocating. The quiet hum of an old jukebox played in the background, but it did little to mask the emptiness in his chest. He was home now, physically anyway, but it wasn't the same. The war was a haunting shadow that followed him, even as he stood in this little diner trying to eat a meal like any other man. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, waved him over to a booth by the window. "Just you today, hun." Daniel nodded, pulling off his jacket and sitting down. "Yeah, just me." She gave him a soft, understanding look before leaving him alone with his thoughts. The menu in front of him blurred in his hands, his mind replaying the faces of soldiers he'd lost, the countless nights he'd spent wondering if he'd even make it back. Now that he was here free, the silence only made him feel more disconnected. The moment the waitress returned with his coffee, Daniel gave a half-hearted smile, trying to push aside the memories that clouded his thoughts. "I'll have the usual," he muttered. "Sure thing," she said, turning away without pressing him for small talk. She was used to people like him, those who came in, ate, and left without saying much. But today, Daniel felt something different stirring within him. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up his spoon and stirred the coffee. His heart was heavy with guilt and doubt. The uniform he'd once worn was now a distant memory, replaced by civilian clothes that didn't feel like him. There was no purpose in his life now, no mission to complete. Just the endless days ahead, each one blending into the next. His mind wandered back to the soldiers he'd left behind, the ones whose lives were cut short, and those who never made it home. But he couldn't keep replaying it, not here, not now. His eyes moved to the window, where the sun was beginning to dip beneath the horizon. The small town outside was peaceful, almost too peaceful. How could the world move on so easily when he couldn't seem to find his place in it? It was then that he noticed the older man sitting at the counter. He had an air of quiet strength about him, a presence that stood in stark contrast to the silence around them. The stranger's weathered face told the story of a life lived hard, gray hair, a few days' stubble, and a jacket that looked like it had seen better days. But there was something in his eyes, a knowing look that hinted at deeper experiences, something Daniel could relate to. The stranger looked up from his coffee, catching Daniel's gaze for a brief moment before nodding his head. "Long day, son?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Daniel was taken aback by the familiarity of the question. It was the kind of thing his fellow soldiers would ask after a mission, the kind of question no one asked civilians. "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice hoarse from the weight of his thoughts. "Feels like every day is a long day." The stranger smiled faintly, as if he'd heard that sentiment 1,000 times. "I hear you, been there myself." He looked down at his cup, swirling it idly, as if lost in his own thoughts. Daniel couldn't help but feel drawn to him, as though there was an unspoken understanding between them. He wasn't the type to open up, but there was something about this man that made him feel like it was okay to talk. After a few moments of silence, the stranger spoke again. "You look like you've seen some things," he said, his voice quiet but probing. Daniel hesitated, unsure how much he was willing to share with a complete stranger. But there was something comforting in the man's tone, something that reminded him of the camaraderie of the battlefield. Maybe this was what he'd been missing, the chance to talk to someone who understood. "I was overseas," Daniel admitted, his voice faltering as he spoke. "In the army, it's hard coming back." The stranger nodded slowly, his eyes deepening with a shared understanding. "I know what you mean. I served too back in the day, Vietnam, but no matter where you're from, war's the same. It changes you. It doesn't leave." The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. It was as if the weight of his own unspoken emotions was being validated by this stranger, this man who, despite the difference in age, seemed to share the same burden. For the first time since his return, Daniel didn't feel so alone. As Daniel sat there, absorbing the older man's words, something inside him shifted. He had always kept his emotions bottled up, as soldiers often did. But there was a weight in the stranger's voice, an authenticity, that made Daniel feel like he could finally release some of the tension that had built up over the months. The stranger, who had introduced himself as Edward, leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. There was a quiet strength in the way he carried himself, like someone who had lived through hardships and emerged with scars that told their own story. Vietnam, huh? Daniel asked, trying to make sense of the connection between them. What was it like? Edward took a long sip from his coffee, then exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting to the window as if reliving memories from a distant time. War, he began, his voice far away, isn't something you can explain to someone who hasn't been there. You see things that stay with you, no matter how much time passes. You learn to live with it, but it never really leaves. Daniel nodded, his eyes glued to Edward's face, searching for something, maybe answers, maybe a way to understand his own struggle. I know what you mean, he said quietly. I was stationed in the Middle East. I never thought I'd come home. Now that I'm back, everything feels different. Nothing feels the same. Edward studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp yet compassionate. I can tell. You've got that look, like you're carrying something heavy. You know, not everyone who comes back from the war makes it back whole. The body might return, but the mind, he trailed off, his words hanging in the air between them like a shadow. Daniel was taken aback. He hadn't expected such raw honesty, especially from a stranger. But there was something about Edward's unfiltered vulnerability that made him want to share more, want to explain how he felt like a ghost in his own life, drifting between a past he couldn't forget and a future he couldn't envision. The conversation lulled for a moment, the clinking of dishes in the background filling the silence. Daniel tried to break the quiet, but the words weren't coming easily. His thoughts were a mess, each one tangled with the others. Why did you stay in this town? Daniel asked, his voice almost tentative. I mean, you could have left, done something else with your life. Edward chuckled softly, a low, gravelly sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. You think about leaving, he said, but the thing about running is, no matter where you go, you take yourself with you. Wherever you are, you're still you. And sometimes staying put is all you've got left. Daniel mulled over Edward's words, the truth of them settling into his bones. He wasn't sure if the older man was trying to help him understand something about himself, or if he was simply sharing his own experience. Either way, Daniel felt a flicker of something inside him, something that resembled hope, or maybe just acceptance. It was the first time in weeks that he felt like there was someone who understood, who could see the depths of the struggle he was going through. I'm not sure I can ever go back to who I was, Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward gave him a knowing look. You won't, but that doesn't mean you can't move forward. You just have to take it one day at a time. Some days, that's all you can do. But if you keep going, eventually, you might find that you don't need to be who you were. You just need to be who you're becoming. Daniel absorbed the words, trying to let them sink in. He wasn't sure if he believed them yet, but something in the way Edward said them made him want to try. It was in the middle of their conversation when the waitress returned with Daniel's food. The plate was warm, the smell of a home-cooked meal filling the air. The familiarity of it almost made him feel like he was back at his mother's table, eating Sunday dinner with his family. Edward didn't look at the food or seem hungry. His eyes remained fixed on Daniel, watching him with an intensity that made Daniel shift in his seat. It was as if Edward knew exactly what he was thinking, even before the words left his mouth. So what about you? Daniel asked, leaning forward slightly. Why are you still here? You ever think about leaving this place? Edward smiled a little, a bittersweet expression crossing his face. I've thought about it, he said, his tone light yet laden with something deeper. But sometimes it's the little things that keep you here, like a meal at a diner, like talking to someone who understands, like remembering that no matter how hard life gets, there's always someone out there who's been through the same thing. The words hit Daniel harder than he expected. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a reason for him to stay here in this small town. Maybe it wasn't about the past or even the future, it was about the present moment. And in this moment, sitting across from Edward, Daniel felt a glimmer of connection, a flicker of hope. Daniel picked at his food, still lost in thought, but something about the conversation with Edward stirred a deeper sense of wanting to do something. For the first time in weeks, he felt a spark, an urge to make things right, to do something that would matter, even if it was small. As he took another bite of his meal, he glanced up at the older man, whose eyes were still focused on Daniel with a quiet intensity. The thought hit him suddenly. Edward hadn't ordered any food. He had been talking with Daniel for what felt like hours, but not once had he asked for anything. And though he didn't seem like someone who would ask, Daniel could tell that this man, this stranger, had lived a lifetime of struggle and sacrifice. The thought of Edward going hungry, sitting there in silence while Daniel enjoyed a warm meal, bothered him more than he expected. "Hey," Daniel said, putting down his fork. "I'll get you something. You shouldn't be sitting here without food." Edward looked at him, surprised, as if he hadn't expected the offer. His eyes softened with gratitude but also with reluctance. "You don't have to do that, son," he said quietly, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm all right." But Daniel wasn't convinced. He couldn't let it go. "No," Daniel insisted, his voice firm but kind. "I want to. You've done more for me in the past hour than anyone has in a long time. Let me get you something to eat." For a moment the two men sat in silence. Edward's weathered face was unreadable, but Daniel could see the hesitation there. Then, with a slow nod, Edward finally relented. "All right," he said, his tone softened. "Thank you." Daniel turned to the waitress who was standing nearby, watching the exchange with a knowing smile. "I'll take another meal for him, the same as mine," he said, gesturing to Edward. As she went to place the order, Daniel's mind raced. It wasn't much, buying a meal for a stranger, but something about it felt significant. The simple act of kindness felt like it was more than just food. It was a way to start healing, to bridge the gap between two lives marked by loss and pain. When the waitress returned with the second plate, Edward looked at the steaming meal before him and then back at Daniel, his expression a mixture of gratitude and humility. "I appreciate this, son," he said quietly, reaching for his fork. The two of them ate in silence, the clinking of silverware and the occasional hum of the jukebox filling the space around them. Daniel felt a strange sense of peace in this moment, something he hadn't felt in a long time. The burden of his past, the weight of his service, seemed to lighten just a little, as though sharing this meal with Edward had somehow made it easier to breathe. Edward didn't say much as he ate, but his eyes occasionally met Daniel, with a glance that spoke volumes. It was a silent acknowledgement, an unspoken bond between two men who had both fought their own battles, on the front lines, yes, but also within themselves. For a moment, Daniel allowed himself to relax. Maybe it was the food, maybe it was the quiet companionship, or maybe it was the simple fact that, in this diner, surrounded by strangers, he didn't feel so alone anymore. After a few minutes, Daniel put his fork down and leaned back in his chair, his hands folded in front of him. "You know," he said, looking over at Edward, "I didn't think much about what I'd be doing when I came home, but now I think I'm starting to understand." Edward raised an eyebrow, clearly curious. "Understand what?" Daniel hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I think I've been running from myself, running from what I did, what I saw. I thought I could just come back and everything would fall into place. But it doesn't work like that. Sometimes you need someone else to help you find your way back." Edward's gaze softened, the lines around his eyes deepening as he listened. "Son," You're not alone in that. A lot of us think we can just leave it all behind, but it doesn't work like that. It stays with you. It's a part of you now, but you can't keep running from it. You have to face it head on, or it'll just keep haunting you. Daniel nodded, feeling the weight of Edward's words. It was like he had heard the truth of it all for the first time. He didn't need to run anymore. He didn't need to pretend that everything was okay. Maybe the first step to healing was simply accepting that he was okay and that was all right. It wasn't weakness, it was humanity. By the time they finished their meals, the diner had grown quieter, the evening crowd thinning out. The waitress came over to collect their plates, offering them both a warm smile. "I'll take care of the check when you're ready," she said, her eyes lingering on Daniel with a look of quiet understanding. Edward stood up slowly, stretching his stiff joints. "You know," he said, "you've got something inside you, son, I can see it. You've got a lot of fight left in you. Don't let it go to waste." Daniel looked up at him, surprised by the compliment. "I don't know if I can fix everything," he said softly, "but maybe, just maybe, I can start somewhere." Edward smiled, the corners of his lips curling up just a little. "That's the first step," he said, patting Daniel on the shoulder. "The rest, well, it'll come when it's ready." As Daniel paid for both meals, his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. For the first time, he felt like there was a way forward. Maybe it wouldn't be easy, but he could try. He didn't have to carry the weight alone. There were people, strangers, who understood, who had walked the same path and could help light the way. Walking out of the diner, the cool evening air felt different. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he felt ready to face it, ready to move forward. As Daniel stepped outside into the crisp evening air, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The stars above seemed brighter than before, and the small town was peaceful, its streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. He had paid for the meal, said his goodbyes to Edward, and was on his way back to his car when he heard a soft voice calling from behind him. "Hey son, wait up." Daniel turned around to see Edward approaching him, a small, folded piece of paper in his hand. He looked around quickly, as if trying to decide whether to hand it over or not. His face was serious now, as though the mood had shifted from casual conversation to something more profound. "Take this," Edward said, his voice steady but tinged with a sense of urgency. "I know it might not make sense now, but I want you to have it. Just read it when you get home, all right?" Daniel took the note without question, his fingers brushing against Edward's worn hand. There was something about the way Edward handed him the note, something almost sacred in the gesture. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a message, a key to something he didn't yet understand. "Thank you," Daniel said, tucking the note into his jacket pocket. His thoughts swirled. What was this about? Why had Edward given him something so cryptic? Edward nodded, his eyes meeting Daniel with that familiar, knowing look. "You'll know when the time's right," he said softly, then turned to walk back down the street without another word. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching him disappear into the night, before finally shaking his head. It didn't make sense, but for some reason, Daniel didn't feel the need to question it. Maybe it was one of those things that would only make sense when it was supposed to. The drive home felt almost surreal. Daniel's mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything that had happened. A meal shared with a stranger, a moment of understanding he hadn't expected, and now a cryptic note. It was all too much to process at once, but there was a sense that the universe was nudging him in some direction he wasn't ready for. He turned onto the road that led to his small apartment. The streets were empty, and the hum of his car engine was the only sound that accompanied him. He glanced at the rearview mirror, his reflection staring back at him, a man who didn't quite recognize himself yet. He was still wearing the same civilian clothes, but they didn't feel like his own. He wasn't sure if he ever would feel like he belonged here again. But as he pulled into the parking lot and parked his car, something in the air seemed to shift. Maybe it was the weight of the note in his pocket, or maybe it was the strange peace that had come from the unexpected encounter with Edward. Either way, it felt like something had changed, even if he couldn't put it into words. Daniel sat in the car for a moment longer, staring at the darkened windows of the apartment building. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face it all, the silence, the memories, the overwhelming sense of being stuck. But he knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would be different from the one he had been walking before. With a deep breath, he grabbed the note from his pocket and unfolded it, squinting in the dim light to read the words written on the aged paper. The paper was slightly crumpled, the ink slightly faded, but the words were clear. The message read, "The battle you fight isn't just on the outside, it's within you. Don't be afraid to face your own demons. The strength you're searching for lies within the ones you've left behind, the ones who fought alongside you. They are your brothers and their spirits are still with you. When you need them most, they'll show you the way." Daniel sat frozen, his fingers tracing the words as if the ink itself might hold the answers he was looking for. His heart raced in his chest, the weight of the note's meaning sinking in with each passing second. This wasn't just some piece of advice. It was a revelation. Edward's words made him feel as if the past he'd been running from was still very much alive, embedded within him like a part of his soul. He reread the note a second time, this time with more purpose. The battle wasn't just about surviving the war, it was about surviving what the war had done to him, and the only way to move forward was to face it. The message spoke of the brothers he had lost, the men he had fought beside. They were gone, but they were still with him, in spirit, urging him to find his strength in their memory. Daniel's hands trembled as he folded the note carefully and placed it back in his pocket. He could feel the heaviness of the words, the weight of the past, but also something else, a call to action. The note had awakened something in him, a desire to not just survive, but to heal, to find peace, and maybe, just maybe, to honor the memory of the men who never made it home. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt ready to face it head-on. That night Daniel didn't sleep much. His mind was too occupied with the note, with the words Edward had left him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. The memories of war, of loss, of comrades who had become family, they all swirled in his mind like ghosts he couldn't outrun. But there was something different in the way he looked at them now. The spirits of his fallen brothers weren't just memories to be mourned. They were guides, helping him find his way through the darkness. They had always been there in the shadows, watching over him, and now they were showing him the path forward. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It never was. But Daniel knew one thing for sure: he wouldn't be walking it alone. He had his brothers with him, and they would help him find his way back to the man he used to be. Days passed, but the note remained on Daniel's mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something big. It was as if the universe had set him on a new path, but the destination was still unclear. Every day he woke up and went through the motions: work, errands, a few visits to the gym. But his mind kept returning to the words Edward had shared with him. One evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, flipping through an old war journal, there was a knock at his door. It was a soft, almost hesitant knock, but it pulled him from his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone, and the sudden interruption left him momentarily disoriented. The world outside seemed to fade as his eyes fixed on the door. He stood up and walked over to it, his boots clicking lightly on the hardwood floor. As he opened the door, he was met with the last person he expected to see: Edward. The old man stood there, his weathered face slightly flushed from the cold night air. His posture was the same, stoic, quiet, but there was something different in his eyes, something urgent. "I know this might seem strange," Edward said, his voice lower than usual, "but I need to talk to you. It's important." Daniel stepped back, still caught off guard by the visit. "Come in," he said, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and concern. "What's going on?" Edward nodded and walked in, but there was a tension in his movements, a quiet urgency that Daniel couldn't ignore. They both sat down at the small table in the kitchen, the light from the overhead bulb casting long shadows across the room. "I've been thinking about what I said," Edward began, his voice steady but his eyes scanning Daniel's face as if trying to gauge something unspoken. "And I realized I didn't give you the full picture. That note, it wasn't just some random advice. It's about a message I've been carrying for a long time, and it's time you knew the rest." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine as the gravity of the conversation began to sink in. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. "Tell me everything," Daniel said, his voice a whisper now, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Edward hesitated for a long time, as if weighing the decision. Then he finally spoke, his voice heavy with the burden of years gone by. "You don't remember me, do you?" Edward asked softly, his gaze piercing. Daniel blinked, the words hanging in the air between them. "What do you mean? Of course I remember you. We met just the other day." Edward shook his head. "No, son, I'm not talking about that. I mean, do you remember me from the war?" Daniel's pulse quickened, his heart beginning to race. The question felt wrong, like something was out of place, but there was a flicker in Edward's eyes that made him want to believe it. "What are you saying?" Daniel asked, his voice now filled with confusion and fear. Edward's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I was there. I fought beside you. I was one of your brothers, one of the men who never made it home." Daniel's mind whirled as the words sank in. His thoughts collided, memories flooding back in a chaotic rush. He tried to grasp onto them, but they slipped away like sand through his fingers. Faces, names, moments from the war that had been buried deep within him. Now they all came rushing back. "But I don't remember you," Daniel stammered, his voice shaky. I don't remember anyone like you." Edward nodded slowly as if he had expected the reaction. "I know. You've been carrying this for years, Daniel, the guilt, the confusion, but you need to understand something." He paused, his face full of compassion. "I never died, not like you thought I did." Daniel's chest tightened as the words hit him like a blow. The air around him seemed to become thick, pressing in on him as the realization began to form. Could it be true? Could Edward, this man who seemed so real, so grounded, actually be someone who had been lost in the fog of Daniel's memories? "Then who are you?" Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart pounding. "Why now? Why come to me now?" Edward exhaled deeply, the weight of the truth heavy on his shoulders. "I'm a manifestation, Daniel. I've been with you all this time, fighting alongside you, even when you didn't know it. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help you heal, to show you that you can move past the war." Daniel's mind raced as the words reverberated through him. A manifestation, a ghost. He couldn't quite wrap his mind around it, but the energy in the room felt different. It was as if Edward was more than just a person. He was something else, something intangible, yet undeniably real. "I don't understand," Daniel muttered, his hand reaching up to rub his face. "Why me? Why did you choose me?" Edward's gaze softened, his eyes filled with empathy. "I didn't choose you. It was always meant to be this way. You were never alone in the war, Daniel, and you're not alone now. The strength you need, the courage you're looking for, it's inside you. I'm just here to remind you." The room fell into silence as Daniel tried to process the revelation. The weight of the past, the memories of war and loss, were suddenly overwhelming. But amidst the confusion, a small part of him understood. Edward, or the manifestation of him, had come for a reason. Not just to relive the past, but to help Daniel confront it, to face the ghosts he had been running from. Edward leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You have a choice, Daniel. You can continue to live in the shadows of your memories, letting the guilt and the pain control you. Or you can let them go and finally embrace the man you're meant to be, the one who deserves peace." Daniel swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He wanted so badly to believe it. He wanted to be free of the pain, the regret, but it wasn't that simple. Nothing ever was. But then Edward smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "I'm not asking you to forget," he said gently. "I'm asking you to forgive yourself." Daniel sat there, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. The ghosts of his past loomed around him, but for the first time he didn't feel quite as alone. The words Edward had spoken echoed in his mind. "Forgive yourself." He stood up, feeling the tension in his body begin to ease. "I'm ready," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to face it." Edward's smile deepened. "That's all I needed to hear." As Edward stood to leave, Daniel realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He was ready to face it, to heal, and to finally let go of the ghosts that had haunted him for so long. The days that followed Edward's visit were a blur of emotions and reflections. Daniel spent hours walking through the streets of his town, lost in thought. Every corner, every familiar place seemed to echo with memories of his time in the military, the camaraderie, the loss, and the wounds he had tried so hard to bury. But now there was a shift. Edward's words rang in his mind like a constant refrain: "Forgive yourself." It wasn't an easy thing to do. Daniel had spent so long carrying the weight of guilt that the idea of letting it go felt almost foreign. How could he? How could he ever forget the men who had died because of his mistakes, his decisions? Yet deep inside, something was changing. Each step he took away from his apartment felt like a step further into the light. For the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to feel the warmth of the sun on his face without the heavy cloak of regret clouding his every thought. It wasn't a dramatic moment of instant clarity, but it was enough to know that he was beginning to let go. He started small, calling old friends, reconnecting with people he had shut out during his darkest days. He sought therapy, joined support groups for veterans, and began speaking openly about his struggles. The journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't always linear, but Daniel finally understood that healing was not about erasing the past. It was about finding peace with it. One afternoon, as Daniel was leaving a local cafe, he bumped into an old acquaintance, someone he hadn't seen in years. It was Rick, a fellow soldier from his unit, one of the few who had survived the last deployment. Rick's eyes widened when he saw Daniel. "Daniel," he said, his voice a mix of surprise and cautious recognition. "Man, it's been a lifetime." Daniel smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. Seeing Rick, the man who had shared the same horrors and challenges, felt like a small victory. They embraced, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "I thought I'd never see you again," Rick said, stepping back to look Daniel over. "You look different. I mean, not just physically. You seem at peace. What happened to you?" Daniel hesitated, unsure of how to put it all into words, but he knew now that there was no shame in speaking the truth. "I've been working through some things. I've been dealing with the past, letting go of it. It's been hard, but I'm getting there." Rick raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by Daniel's candor. "It's good to see you like this. I'm glad you're finally finding a way through. It wasn't easy for any of us, man." They talked for hours, about the war, about what they had lost, and about the things they were slowly rebuilding in their lives. It felt like a reunion not just of two old friends, but of brothers who had faced the unimaginable and come out on the other side. When they parted ways, Daniel felt something in his chest loosen. He had carried so much of that weight alone for so long, but now he realized that he wasn't the only one struggling. He wasn't the only one who needed healing. And as they said their goodbyes, Rick gave him one final piece of advice. "Keep pushing forward, man. The past will always be a part of us, but it doesn't have to define us. We're still here, we're still standing." A few weeks later, Daniel returned to the Veterans Hall, the place where he had first sought refuge after his return from the war. It had been a long time since he had stepped through those doors, but something had changed in him. He no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He felt like he belonged. The familiar faces greeted him warmly, a few veterans who had always been there for him, even when he couldn't see it. He walked in with his head held higher, his heart lighter than it had been in years. As he entered the main hall, he spotted the small group of men gathered around a table, sharing stories and laughing. It felt like a small victory just being there, alive, whole, and present. No longer haunted by the ghosts of the past, he was ready to forge new connections and honor the memory of those who had fallen. Daniel, one of the older veterans, called out, standing up from his chair. "It's good to see you, son. We were wondering where you'd gone." Daniel smiled and joined them at the table. "I've been working on myself, figured it was time to come back home." The laughter in the room grew louder as they swapped stories, as if time had never passed. It was bittersweet, but there was a joy in the air now that hadn't been there before. Daniel felt like he had finally come full circle. He had learned to heal, to accept the past, and to embrace the future. And for the first time, he was truly at peace with the man he had become. One evening, as Daniel sat in his apartment, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was familiar, though it sent a shiver down his spine. It was Edward. "I knew you'd make it through, son," Edward's voice said, calm and steady. "I'm proud of you." Daniel swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. He had not expected to hear from Edward again, and the emotion in his voice was overwhelming. "I don't know how to thank you," Daniel replied, his words thick with gratitude. "You gave me something I didn't even know I needed. You helped me heal." Edward's voice softened, almost as if he was smiling. "No need to thank me, Daniel. It was always in you. You just had to see it for yourself. And now you're ready." Daniel nodded, wiping his eyes before the tears could fall. "I'm ready. I've made peace with everything. I'm finally free." The call ended, but Daniel knew that Edward's role in his life had come to an end. The man, the manifestation, whatever he had been, had helped him find the strength to move forward. And now, Daniel was no longer held back by the past. He had found his own redemption, his own peace. As the weeks turned into months, Daniel's life continued to evolve. He returned to school, pursuing a degree in counseling to help other veterans who were struggling just like he had. The once daunting weight of his memories had become a source of strength, and he was now in a position to give back. He also began volunteering at the same Veterans Hall where he had once found refuge, this time offering support to others who were navigating the difficult journey of recovery. Each day, he met new faces, men and women who had their own stories of struggle, of loss, of survival. And each day, Daniel found new purpose in helping them find the peace he had once thought impossible. In time, Daniel realized that the road to healing was not a solitary one. It was a journey made easier with the help of others. And as he looked out at the world he had once feared to face, he knew that he had come home, not just to the Veterans Hall, but to himself. Months had passed since Daniel's life began to settle into a new rhythm. Each day, he became more involved in his work at the Veterans Hall and his studies, striving to make a difference in the lives of others who had been where he once was. Yet, there were still moments when the weight of the past crept in, fleeting memories of battle, of the soldiers he had lost, of the fear that had once ruled his every step. But those moments no longer had the same power over him. They no longer consumed him. Daniel had learned how to live with them, to see them not as a curse, but as part of his story, one that had shaped him into the man he had become. One evening, as Daniel walked home from his counseling session, something caught his eye. A small group gathered near the local park. He recognized some of the faces. They were veterans from the hall, some of the men he had worked closely with. They were talking in hushed voices, their attention focused on a single figure in the center of the group. Curious, Daniel approached them, his steps quiet. When he saw who stood at the center of the gathering, his heart skipped a beat. It was Edward. The man he had thought he had said goodbye to long ago was standing before him, his presence as powerful as ever. The group of veterans was listening intently, hanging on to every word Edward spoke. His voice, steady and commanding, echoed with wisdom and strength. Daniel approached, a sense of disbelief filling him as he realized that Edward wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He had come to this town for a reason, and that reason was more than just to help Daniel heal. It was to ensure that the legacy of all those who served, who sacrificed, would never be forgotten. Edward turned to face Daniel as he approached, a knowing smile spreading across his face. "I knew you'd find your way back here," Edward said, his tone warm but filled with a quiet strength. "This place, this community, it needs you. It needs your story." Daniel stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Edward stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Your healing has inspired more than just yourself. It's touched everyone around you. Your journey of redemption is a gift, not just to you, but to all those who need to hear it. The work you're doing, it's not just helping others to survive. It's showing them that they can thrive, that they can heal too." Daniel swallowed, the gravity of Edward's words slowly sinking in. He had never considered himself a hero. He had never seen his struggles as anything worth sharing. But now, in this moment, he realized that his story was part of something much bigger. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the thousands of veterans who carried the same pain, the same guilt, the same scars. His journey was a beacon of hope for them. Over the next few weeks, Daniel found himself at the heart of a new mission, one that had grown out of his own healing and his desire to give back. Edward's presence seemed to have sparked something in him. He started speaking at the Veterans Hall, sharing his journey and encouraging others to take their first steps toward healing. More than that, Daniel began mentoring younger veterans, men and women who had only recently returned from the front lines and were struggling to adjust to civilian life. They came to him for advice, for support, and for hope. Every session was different. Every individual was different. But one thing was always the same: Daniel's willingness to be vulnerable, to share his own darkness, allowed others to open up and begin their own healing process. It wasn't long before Daniel realized that Edward had been preparing him for this moment all along. Edward had shown him the power of redemption, of forgiveness, and of resilience. Now, it was his turn to carry that torch and pass it on to others. The old man's words echoed in his mind every day. "Your journey is a gift." Daniel began to understand what that truly meant. It wasn't just a personal journey, it was a shared one. He was part of a greater legacy that had been forged in the fires of war, and now it was his responsibility to ensure that legacy lived on. One day, as Daniel walked into the Veterans Hall, he noticed something different. There was a quiet hum of excitement in the air. Something was about to happen. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he felt it deep in his gut. The door opened, and a familiar face stepped inside, the face of a young soldier, a recent veteran who had just returned from overseas. He was nervous, uncertain, and his eyes darted around the room as if he was looking for a place to hide. Daniel immediately recognized the pain in his eyes. It was the same pain he had seen in his own reflection countless times. Without hesitation, Daniel walked over to the young man, extending his hand. "Hey, man," he said softly. "I'm Daniel. I know what you're feeling right now. You don't have to face this alone." The young soldier hesitated, then slowly took Daniel's hand. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know how to live with all of this." Daniel smiled gently, the weight of his own journey giving him the wisdom to speak the truth. "You can. We all can. It's not about forgetting what happened. It's about accepting it, learning from it, and finding peace with it. We're here to help you through it." As the young soldier sat down with Daniel, the room began to fill with others. They were all part of the same story now, part of the same healing process. And in that moment, Daniel realized that this was his legacy. It wasn't about a single person's redemption, but about a community of people coming together, helping one another find peace. The torch had passed, and now it was his turn to keep the flame alive for those who needed it the most. The days turned into weeks, and Daniel's work continued to grow. The Veterans Hall became a beacon of light for many who had once felt lost in the darkness of their own minds. His story had become the foundation for something larger, something that reached beyond the walls of the hall and into the hearts of everyone who came through the door. One evening, as Daniel sat in his office, a quiet knock came at his door. When he looked up, there stood Edward. "Did you think you'd be free of me that easily?" Edward asked with a smile that was both warm and knowing. Daniel chuckled, his heart full. "I don't think I ever really wanted to be free of you." Edward nodded, taking a seat across from him. "You've done well, Daniel. You've carried the torch just like I knew you would. But now it's time for me to say goodbye. You don't need me anymore. You've found your own strength." Daniel stood up, walking over to Edward and placing a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for everything." Edward smiled. "You've always had the strength, Daniel. I was just here to help you see it. And now you can help others see it too." With that, Edward stood up and walked toward the door. As he opened it, he turned to Daniel one last time. "You're ready now," he said. "You've created a legacy." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the night like a fading memory.